Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with André Sturesson. Hey friends, hope you're having a great day. Are you following me on Instagram and Facebook? Please go to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook, or both for that matter, to get the latest episodes, inspiration, and more. Please take a pause and go there. Also, if you like the episode, please share it with a friend, family member, or somebody else who you think might like it. Welcome back, friends, to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with me, André Sturesson, a science-focused podcast where we explore, learn, and improve our lives together. How does our life affect our genes and, in turn, our health? Can our well-being make us more resilient? Then how does threat and uncertainty affect our health? In today's episode, Steve provides his thoughts on these questions and a lot more. Steve Cole, he's a professor of medicine and psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences in the UCLA School of Medicine. And he studies, for example, how life events, loneliness, well-being, and subjective experiences affect our gene expression and our health. Friends, I really hope you will enjoy today's episode. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I'm really happy to have you on. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And so I'm really happy to talk to you. And I think that perhaps we should just start off, with the basics. For those who have never heard about genes, for those who have never heard about genomics and this kind of stuff, maybe we should just start there with these concepts and just explain them in a nutshell. So if you could just explain, what a gene is and what genomics is for those who have never heard about it before.
Yeah, basically you can think of genes as sort of blueprints for making a human body. And it turns out there's about 20,000 different genes needed to produce the human cells that become a functioning human body. So you can think of it as a pack of, sort of blueprints that's 20,000 pages long. And in genomics, what we're trying to understand is basically which specific pages are needed in any given cell at any given time in order to keep that cell healthy. Which pages become, sort of activated, get read and translated into a protein form to produce a disease. Like, let's say if you have a heart attack, that's usually because there was an atherosclerotic plaque in your coronary artery, which is like a big blood vessel that feeds resources to your heart muscle. So that atherosclerotic plaque, it turns out, is not like a random event. It actually gets built. It's a structure that gets built like a scab inside your blood vessel. And that there's actually instructions that go into making that scab. Particular proteins need to get made at particular times and in particular places in order to create that giant, sort of calcified scab in the blood vessel wall. So if you want to understand why people have heart attacks and you're a biologist, what you really are asking is, sort of which genes get turned on or expressed in that particular set of cells in this particular person at this particular time. In other words, why does this person have an atherosclerotic plaque and their neighbor doesn't? So that's why, in a nutshell, we, sort of study genomics in biomedical research. And then there's a separate set of questions about just, how do you create a normal, happy, healthy, functioning human being? A more kind of basic scientific question, just how, what's the instruction manual for making a human body in its kind of optimal physiological sense? And that's something that, sort of evolutionary biologists and a kind of more theoretical crowd look at. So genomics gets used by two communities, one set of sort of disease detectives trying to figure out what's gone wrong and how to fix it, and then another group of researchers who are trying to figure out just like, what is this human? How did it get made?
Exactly. Okay, so you would say that the gene is pretty much, or genomics is pretty much that our genes are expressed and then then like stuff are created, like the plaques you were talking about, or other small proteins or other stuff, basically.
That's exactly right. So another way to think about it is every cell in our body has that same set of blueprints, 20,000 genes. But in any given cell, only a minority of those genes are actually active. And in different cells, different subsets, different, sort of complements of genes are active. You can think about it as like ordering off a menu of 20,000 options. And at each dinner, you select sort of a different set of ingredients for making your meal. And genomics is essentially the same way. It's like which particular genomic ingredients are active to make, let's say, a brain cell or a muscle cell, or to create these atherosclerotic plaques that lead to heart attacks.
Right. I think one thing that I found very interesting when I was doing a little bit of research before our conversation here is that it seems like our subjective experience. So, I mean, basically, what happens in our life and how we interpret it, and what we think about, like what happens in our life, really seems to affect our biology and also our genes. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's really kind of a surprise to the genomics community. So, as I described earlier, genomicists usually come at the human genome from the perspective of disease or from the perspective of, sort of what we call in biology development. How do you make a human body? They think of these things that they study as, sort of like essentially an abstract human body with a concrete disease. They don't actually, oddly enough, think of the bodies that they study as living, breathing human beings with thoughts and feelings and concerns. So, that view of what a gene does is the one that I articulated earlier. Seems like, it's making a machine like a body, but then there's like this separate ghost of a spirit that somehow inhabits that body, a life that body leads. And all of that stuff is happening on some other plane of existence. Genomicists just feel like that's too far out. I can't comprehend that kind of thing. So genomicists traditionally have thought of genes in this very kind of mechanical way, like their notion of a big bundle of genes is a cell, right? So they sort of feel like that's the most complexity and sort of aggregation that I can comprehend.
Right.
But there's a separate strand of research in the world of social epidemiology that has really arisen over the last few decades, and makes it clear that many of the diseases that we are plagued with are not randomly or fairly distributed throughout the population. That differences in the way we live, differences in the life circumstances that we inhabit, differences in the conditions under which we live, all of those things influence whether we're going to get a heart attack or not. Sort of a classical example is poverty. People who live in poverty tend to have a higher risk of most diseases, including these chronic diseases like cancer, cardiovascular diseases, heart attacks, that kind of thing, and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. So the epidemiology tells us that there's something in the world outside a human body that affects these disease processes. So these two communities, these kind of social epidemiologists and sort of genomics researchers, traditionally have lived in their own little camps. And these camps are actually surprisingly strongly patrolled. Very rarely does somebody from one camp, sort of wander out of their safe space and find themselves in the other camp. But I'm actually a sort of an inveterate wanderer. So what ended up happening is I got interested in the mechanics of diseases very early, actually back in the HIV epidemic, back in the late 90s and early 2000s. I got interested in why, HIV infection would consume some bodies fast and, largely, sort of spare other bodies. There's tremendous variability in how quickly a person would get sick and die if they contracted HIV infection. Some people got sick within 2 years, other people stayed healthy for 10 to 20 years. And, there was a complete spectrum in between.
Right.
So in a virus, as we all remember now, the viruses are nothing more than genes. And so if I wanted to understand why some people got sick fast, I knew I was really asking a question about virology. And virologists tend to understand what's going on in terms of genes that are present in the viral genome and the patterns in which they're activated in particular cells in response to particular stimuli. So very early, I was kind of forced into this genomics mindset, maybe much earlier than most other health research were, because I was interested in viruses. And there's just nothing else to work with in viruses. They don't have brains, they don't have muscles, all they are is genes. And so that's what got me started. And then right around the same time, the human genome was starting to be sequenced. And so at some point, we realized that we could take these principles about how the social and psychological world of, let's say, a gay man with HIV infection, how that was changing the activity of the HIV genome. We could use the same principles that we were discovering in that context and apply them to the broader, 20,000 gene human genome instead of the, 12 gene, HIV genome. And in that case, sort of use viruses as sort of like a practice run for understanding these broader principles in social epidemiology. And the case that really got us started had to do with loneliness. So I'm sure you'll ask more about that in a few minutes. But essentially, it was an effort to use genomics to understand this input-output relationship between social risk factors and diagnosed disease. We knew genes had to be somewhere in between those two things. And that's what I've been trying to do, is to take these tricks we learned in HIV infection, essentially, and apply them into the context of the human genome as a whole.
Right. So what you're saying basically, or just from my understanding, is that things that happen in a person's life, so let's say that you have HIV, for example, so how you live your life has an effect on how well it will go with the HIV and the disease.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly what we were trying to understand. In other words, we have enough epidemiologic data now to say pretty confidently how you lead your life matters for whether you're going to get diagnosed with a disease. So you can think of that as step one. And the next question is, what connects those two things? In other words, if you think of how you live your life as A, and getting diagnosed with a heart attack or a case of Alzheimer's disease or metastatic cancer as C, we're interested in understanding what is the B physiology that gets you from A to C. In other words, if living your life changes your physiological function, another way to put it is, if you get a disease C, there has to be some physiology that helped create that disease. And we want to know what that is, in large part because we want to stop it. So the social epidemiology you can think of as like the provocation or the motivation to do this kind of biological, what we call mechanism work. How do you transmit information from the world of subjective experience, like I feel threatened or insecure, I feel, just stressed out and unconfident. I feel worried about how the world is going to respond to me. There's all kinds of different psychologies that we know now correlate with differences in disease risk. And we're really trying to now map out how that comes about. So we could, it might be easier to kind of think about this from the perspective of certain concrete instances. Like loneliness is a great example.
Yeah.
So I started, in the context of HIV infection, and I had worked up these tricks with a virus that has, a very, very small number of genes, less than 20 genes, basically. So we can use that, we can analyze that pretty well. And I was talking at a think tank meeting about how we were doing this and looking at, for instance, how these genes operated in gay men who were in the closet. So they basically were hiding their homosexual identity from everybody around them.
Yeah.
They were afraid. Yeah, they were afraid that they were going to get not just rejected. I mean, being rejected sounds, feeble, like, oh, I don't like you. Well, in these men's cases, if they were found out to be gay, they might lose their jobs. They might lose their family. In other words, their family might not speak to them anymore. They might be physically assaulted. There was, a variety of really serious, consequences to this kind of bland term of being rejected. So a certain, sort of very kind of risk-sensitive fraction of the population decided, I don't want to be exposed to those kinds of risks. I would rather actually hide myself, this important part of my life, who I spend time with, who I care about, who means most to me in the world. I'm going to hide all of that information, essentially 8 hours a day at work is typically where they did it. Yeah. And I'm going to hide that from my family of origin. And, because I just feel like I don't want to have to deal with that stress and risk of really bad outcomes in my life. But what we know is that those guys who are living in the closet get sick and die 20% faster when they contract HIV infection. Right. In other words, hiding all of that stuff in your life doesn't protect you. It's stressful, basically, to manage that kind of concealment. It's stressful to have to worry all the time. Am I going to be discovered and found out? Am I going to fall from grace? It's stressful to have to constantly self-censor in terms of what you're talking about. It's stressful to manage these different worlds. So all of that stress and strain was, sort of taking a toll on their resistance to HIV disease progression. In other words, how fast the virus was able to overtake the immune system and drag it down. So that, we can talk about that in the abstract, but, what I get paid to do is actually work out the fine details on that, kind of the fine print in the story. And, hopefully if we know those fine-grained details, then we can actually either develop or take off the shelf of existing treatments some kind of an intervention to block those effects. And that's important because we don't want, these people to be kind of cursed twice. Not only are they leading a stressful life because they're trying to manage this social prejudice, but they're also leading a shorter life. They're robbed of years of life by virtue of this essentially sort of a social convention or a social rejection of their lifestyles. For sure. So there's kind of like a moral or a justice component to these kinds of things, because it doesn't just represent, a personal decision that is kind of up to you. It has costs in terms of your lifespan and your well-being. So we got interested in that kind of thing, and then, sort of we're talking about that in kind of think tanks, and ended up bumping into this loneliness researcher, John Cacioppo, who is kind of just one of the most prodigious thinkers in the world of kind of, life and how it influences our health and well-being. And John's been very interested for decades now in how loneliness in particular, how a sense of being isolated from others, of feeling unsafe around others, of feeling not close to others, of feeling kind of detached either from your community or alienated from humanity in general. John really understood long before most other behavioral and biomedical scientists did how much this kind of psychological experience, sort of chews up a body. And he made it his life's work to figure out, okay, what's going on in loneliness? Why does it exist? Why does it befall certain people? What's going on in a brain? What's going on in our psychology? And then how does that turn into what we see in the epidemiology? And that is lonely people have about a 1.5 to kind of twofold risk in a variety of different diseases relative to non-lonely people. In other words, they're at higher risk of neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's diseases, metastatic cancers, higher risk of atherosclerosis and heart attacks, higher risk of infectious diseases, including both things like HIV infection. They have a higher risk of accelerated disease progression, a higher risk of contracting colds and flus, probably a higher risk of coronavirus infection. In a sort of tragic irony, all of this social distancing and to the extent that it robs us of a sense of social support.
For sure.
is probably also aggravating all that kind of stuff. So that's essentially why we do this stuff, is to try and figure out, okay, in a human body running on these 20,000 human genes, what's going on differently in the body of a lonely person that would lead to these differences in disease risk.
Right. So there's quite a lot of difference if somebody's lonely, or you also mentioned before, if somebody feels threatened or uncertain and those kind of stuff. And that seems to also to increase the risk. Another thing that I was really interested to talk to you about is, it seems like our genome is, I mean, the 20,000 genes seems to be like adapting to our lives. Do you believe that like the purpose of having this flexibility in our genome is to like help our species to survive? Or what do you think is like the purpose of having this flexibility with our genome?
I think you're exactly right. There's different strategies for how to run a genome in the animal kingdom, of which we are members, despite the fact that we forget sometimes. In the spectrum, there's sort of what you'll call pre-programmed animals, and there are what you would call environmentally responsive animals. Environmentally responsive animals are basically, creatures like us.
Yeah.
They're born a little bit kind of blank slates. They need to be trained on how to make sense of the world and how to respond to it, how to survive and thrive. There's other animals that, like they get born and they crawl off and they start being that animal with a bunch of pre-programmed instructions. That works for some animals, but in general, the risk of that first pre-programmed strategy is that it's very dependent on an ecosystem, on a stable ecosystem, basically. Yeah. The world around you has to match the program that you're born with. And if that world changes, then you're basically at a disadvantage, likely to die, or at the very least not pass on your genes. So the human strategy is the ultimate example of an organism that's born very flexible and needs to be trained about its environment, but that allows it to be trained in different ways to accommodate different environments. So what's happening in the world of kind of social genomics, when the social world starts regulating the human genome, is essentially we are perceiving the world around us. It's a separate question, how accurate those perceptions are. But in any event, in principle, what's happening is we look at the world around us, we come to some kind of a view about what's really true, what's really out there, and especially, is what's out there threatening, or is what's out there kind of good and safe and secure? That distinction between safety versus threat, or security versus threat, is kind of a fundamental organizing principle of brains for these environmentally adaptable organisms.
Right.
So,
do you believe that that is like? Do you believe that like that is like the main one of the main things in our genome to be able to handle a threatening or a good environment?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. Is that you can think of our genome as having flexibility in terms of which genes are activated, which genes are shut off in any given cell, in any given person at any given time. And we have pretty good reason to believe that this sense of safety versus threat, or this sense that things are okay, even if I'm not perfectly safe, at least I'm doing what's most important, versus I'm not okay, or what I care about, the things I value are not okay. This is a fundamental kind of, you can think of one of the major axes or one of the major dimensions of variation in human experience. And we believe that this is especially important for controlling genome function, in large part because there's a lot of clearly identifiable cellular infrastructure for conveying those experiences from the brain out into the rest of the body. And so we can track very well how the kinds of genomic responses we see in threatened organisms. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But basically, we can track the flow of information from the brain through the fight or flight stress responses in the autonomic nervous system, these these fight or flight stress responses that are mediated by what are called sympathetic nerve fibers that flow out of your spinal column. They target every major organ system in their body, and they release neurotransmitters, signaling molecules that essentially represent feeling threatened or insecure.
Right.
And when those neurotransmitters get released, they interact with receptors on the surface of cells. And those receptors, in turn, control intracellular signaling pathways within the cell that end up changing in a very clearly definable biochemical way, changing the profile of genes that are active versus inactive in a given cell. So there, we can track every step of the way this flow of information from life as we experience it down through the nervous system and into the kind of the cellular environment of our bodies, and even at the level of the precision of saying these specific genes are the ones that are activated when we're feeling threatened or insecure. And this particular set is activated in, let's say, immune cells. A different subset is activated in muscles. A different subset is activated in liver cells. In other words, in every tissue of the body, we can now map out how our bodies are programmed by millions of years of evolved wisdom, essentially baked into the wiring diagram of the human genome. We can now map out how that information flows from our experience of life, and especially from these major dimensions like threat versus security, to down to the kind of the molecular level. So now this doesn't mean that that's the only dimension that matters for life. There's all kinds of other things going on. But one of the easiest to see kind of low-hanging fruit pathways involves this sense of security that lonely people don't have, this sense of security that guys in the closet don't have, this sense of security that poor people don't have, this sense of security that recently bereaved people don't have, this sense of security that people with post-traumatic stress disorder don't have. In other words, you can go through the sort of the merry-go-round, the whole kind of panoply of adverse life circumstances that are correlated with these disease risks. And we can say one of the things that many of them have in common, the vast majority share in common, is leaving people feeling insecure and threatened around the things that they care most about.
So that is like, would you say that is like, or one of the, or even the like thing that affects our gene expression the most, to feel threatened or insecure?
That I would say in everyday human life, that is certainly one of the most important ones, and possibly the most important one. It's one that we actually don't see, sort of huge variation on, in part because we as humans have learned to live in ways that minimize a chronic sense of threat or uncertainty. But the solutions that we come up with, the cultures that we've created for ourselves, are sort of optimal for maintaining the security of some people. But, within every culture, there's still these gradients of status and security that end up creating gradients of, sort of biological safety, if you will, that end up in turn creating gradients of threat-related gene expression, which in turn contribute to those disease processes.
Yeah.
So this is, I would say, it's a very important one, but its importance is contextualized within these stable, sort of cultural environments that we inhabit. If we inhabited a cultural environment where we randomly got burned by flame every few hours or something like that, that flame-related change in gene expression would be much bigger than the change in gene expression that comes from, feeling threatened or insecure.
Exactly.
So, once upon a time, that kind of stuff actually was relatively normal. I mean, it's probably shocking for many of our listeners to realize, but until fairly recently, war and famine and sort of catastrophes made by both human and natural sources were pretty common. Actually, it's only in the last maybe 100 years or so that we've really been able to protect a significant fraction of the human race from kind of the daily occurrence of these things. And the same thing for infectious diseases, right? I mean, that used to be the dominant cause of death, typically early in life, until, essentially about 100 years ago at this point.
Right.
So it's not to say that this is the only important dimension of gene regulation, but given the way we now live, it's one of the biggest remaining, it's kind of like the dominant or a dominant remaining influence, one that we haven't been able to eradicate or to kind of secure the variance on this particular dimension as well as some of the other ones.
Right. I mean, it really makes sense also, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective to handle threat and insecurity and also all those kinds of things. But I know that you've been doing a lot of studies when it comes to the more misery part of life. But I know that you're also focusing right now on more of the good parts in life. And one thing that I find very interesting is do you believe that there is a blueprint in our genes for how to live the best life in general?
Yeah, actually, surprisingly enough, I do. I didn't necessarily believe that maybe 10 years ago.
Okay.
But, I'll tell you
Everything
this funny
changes.
Story that you're kind of launching. Right, exactly. So the upshot is, this story that I've been telling you so far, you can think of as the first generation of social genomics research, trying to understand gradients in disease from the perspective that epidemiologists take. And epidemiologists their founding experience is infectious disease.
Yeah.
So they're always looking for the pathogen that causes the disease. They're looking for the agent, the bad guy that is going to make people sick. And so naturally, when social epidemiology got started,
how is that for
said,
you?
okay,
Always focusing on the bad stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's a little depressing. I mean, as I've just described it, you can just say, Steve is the guy that gets paid to, understand how the human genome translates misery into death.
Exactly.
Right. So that's
here's Steve. He will tell you how you will die.
Yeah.
You're great. Right. Here I am.
And if you want to die faster, he's got a bunch of suggestions for you.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
You want to die slower, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the challenge. Is okay, Steve, great. You've told me how to accelerate my death, but guess what? That's not actually what I'm trying to do right now. How would I live longer? And, it was exactly these kinds of questions that led me to pause a little bit and say, well, that's a fair question. And we started looking for what in behavioral science we call resilience factors. These are properties of a person's life or their psychology or their circumstances that allow them to stay healthy in otherwise threatening life circumstances.
That is so interesting, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, within any adverse environment, let's think of people living in poverty. Even people living in poverty, they're not 100% going to get heart attacks. They just get heart attacks at a somewhat higher rate than people living in affluence.
Right.
So you could ask about the people living in poverty who don't get heart attacks and say, what are they doing differently? And can we generalize that? Can we help other people living in poverty not have heart attacks by learning something from these kind of bright spots, these people who are doing well despite these adverse life circumstances?
Right.
So we started looking around, and the whole biomedical enterprise again is programmed to look for pathogens. They're not programmed to look in general for what we would call resilience factors or resistance factors. They get around to that eventually, but in the beginning, it's always about the bad guys.
Yeah.
So, I started talking to, again, behavioral scientists about happiness and well-being in the psychological sense, and what they were discovering were the kind of the ingredients for that kind of a life. And we were looking, to see whether, for instance, are happy people less likely to have these threat-related gene expression profiles? And the answer was, well, actually, in general, no, which was sort of a disappointment with some of the happiness psychologists. But it turns out that there are a variety of different kinds of happiness out there. And broadly speaking, the happiness researchers distinguish between hedonic well-being, which is what we typically think of as happiness, which is kind of mirthfulness, laughter, pleasant Epicurean experiences, in the sense that Epicurus, the philosopher, meant. In other words, eating good food, seeing beautiful sights, watching beautiful entertainment, having pleasant time. In Epicurus's construction of the good life as a philosopher, he just thought a good life is a collection of a bunch of good days, basically.
Yeah.
And good days filled with good meals and good friends and good entertainment and so on and so forth. So as we looked at the Epicurean psychology, we didn't really see that there was any lower rates of these kind of threat-related gene expression profiles. But interestingly enough, there's another version of happiness that is kind of more classically ascribed to Aristotle, which basically says that the deepest form of happiness comes from devoting yourself to some kind of really virtuous cause or some kind of self-transcendent goal or purpose beyond your own immediate self-gratification. So if immediate self-gratification was kind of the Epicurean recipe for the good life, the Aristotelian recipe for the good life was doing good works, trying to make the world a better place, trying to help other people, trying to create new things or discover new things, striving to improve the lot of humanity.
And also grow as a person, right? There's a lot about that as well, right? Trying to exactly right. Yeah.
Striving to improve the lot of humanity by improving your own lot, by improving your own wisdom, your own virtue. So in modern happiness theorists call this eudaimonic well-being, after a term Aristotle coined, where he thought eudaimonia, essentially the most virtuous life, was finding the person you were meant to be, your inner spirit, or what they called your true daemon, your true inner spirit. Yeah. So eudaimonia was finding the true you. And so interestingly, when you look at measures of eudaimonic well-being, like sort of measures of having a sense of purpose or meaning in your life, that actually was correlated with lower rates of these threat-related gene expression profiles. And that was a surprise to us. I mean, we hadn't expected this. Positive, happiness psychologists hadn't expected this.
Yeah.
But it has turned out to be a fairly reliable finding that people with higher levels of purpose or meaning in their lives show lower levels of these threat-related gene expression profiles. And so much of what
can we just pause there for 1 second? So basically,
sure.
Just so I understand it correctly. So if you have this this hedonic, more when it's more about you're having spending time with friends and having a good day, and then we have the other eudaimonic, which is more going towards your potential and helping others and having a purpose. So those who had more the second type, the eudaimonic, the purpose type, they were less likely to get diseases and to get cancer and heart attack and those kind of stuff. Or
that's right.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think great.
It's a short answer. I mean, it's kind of surprising. We didn't know this at the time. I mean, we got interested in genomics in the world of misery, and then we started asking, what in the world of happiness or well-being would reduce that genomic fingerprint? But it turns out when we got there in genomics, and in parallel, a bunch of other epidemiologists, in part because we'd done the genomic research, that led epidemiologists to sort of go back. And some had done, in fairness, some had also begun to do this before we did the genomic work. But the genomic work really kind of prompted people to go back and look more deeply at eudaimonic well-being and whether it was predictive of lower rates of those diseases that you just described. And the answer was yes, it is.
Right.
So
but why do you think now. But why do you think that is? Why do you think, because I think that is a very interesting finding. Why would a eudaimonic well-being affect those kind of diseases?
Well, that is a great
The $1 million question.
Such a great question. This is what we study all day long.
Yeah.
So essentially, that is what we do these days. So I'll tell you a little bit about our leading theory. And in science, it's easy to refute theories. It's easy to find, if a theory doesn't fit the empirical reality, you can discard the theory.
Yeah.
It's hard to say one particular theory is right, but you can at least say which particular theory fits the evidence at hand better than, let's say, another theory might. Yeah. So the best theory we have right now is that eudaimonic well-being involves a different kind of happiness in the brain than hedonic well-being, and the wiring from that form of happiness or well-being, that the wiring from seeking and hoping and striving, that experience of seeking, hoping, striving, creating, caring for others, trying to make a better world, that lives in a particular set of brain structures called the ventral striatum, right, essentially. And that section is different from the brain structures that are involved in getting what you want. Like, if I eat a tasty candy right now, my ventral striatum will go,
interesting.
Whatever. But there's a separate part of my brain, a more what we would traditionally call reward-related region that goes, hey, that was really yummy. Great, eat another one.
Yeah.
So we've got two different brain circuits for positive psychology. At least we may have more than that, but at least, in a crude, simple sense, we've got one set of brain structures that are involved in chasing after what we want, what we think is important, what we value. And a different set of brain structures involved in going, that is really yummy. That's great. I'm so happy.
Right.
So that first set of brain structures has wiring in the brain that connects it to the brain stem, the sort of lower part of our brains that are involved in essentially sort of serving as the operating system for our body. The brain stem is what's controlling these fight or flight stress responses that are going out there and regulating the genes' activities in immune cells or in muscle cells or in liver cells. So the brain stem is getting these messages essentially from the ventral striatum that says you're doing what you should. That you're on track. The things you care about, you're doing the best you can to support the things that you value most. And that valuation can take a lot of different forms. It can take the form of caregiving. It can take the form of seeking to discover things. It can take the form of creating things. Anything that's kind of a striving or a wanting or a hoping or an aspirational kind of psychology activates this ventral striatal circuitry, and that in turn seems to inhibit the activity of these fight or flight signaling pathways. And it may also activate pathways that are involved in resting and regenerating physiological tissues as well. That part's a little.
I just think that, like, from an evolutionary lens, that really makes sense. Like, from an evolutionary perspective, we should help our offspring and try to help the group. I'm not 100% sure of that, but helping our offspring and striving for goals that are good for our families and helping others. It really seems to it really makes sense from an evolutionary lens, I think.
I think you're exactly right. And I would be even less hesitant than you are in terms of helping your group. There has been historically a lot of debate about sort of the evolutionary virtues of being pro-social.
Yeah.
But most of that debate has been structured by mathematical models that are just simply myopic. They just don't take into account the full range of costs and benefits of helping behavior. I mean, a simple way to put it colloquially is that the models that question whether helping others is useful are usually models that assume that people are competing with one another to have their genes represented in the next generation of human beings. But over most of our evolutionary history, human beings weren't competing to be in the next generation. They were competing with predators.
To survive. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so if you're getting rewarded for, sort of effectively running a community, and this is the whole human life history strategy, is based on community. Humans are not that big. We're not that strong. We don't have armor plating. We are a lone human being is basically lunch for another animal. So if we've survived and thrived as much as we have, it must be because our strategy of banding together into communities so that a bunch of individually weak human beings can still take down the saber-toothed tiger, or can still take down the mammoth and then eat for a year or something like that. Humans together in networks can get things done that even the biggest, strongest competing animals cannot get done. So humans generally, in the broadest scheme of things, they are not competing with other humans. They're competing with other animals, and they're competing with extinction. Right. They're competing with, can I stay warm in the ice age? Can I avoid being eaten by this giant predator? So once you start thinking about that as the organizing, the organizing design around the human genome, it becomes really easy to see why human beings would be incentivized evolutionarily to become pro-social, to become, information seeking, to become help giving, because that's what works for an organism that's our size and our strength.
For sure.
So in the long run, that is probably, I think you hit it on the head. What we can do now is we can take this principle that seems to be baked into human biology, this idea that seeking and striving and helping and creating and discovering and wanting, broadly speaking, and doing that with other human beings as our fundamental safety signal, that kind of psychology then leaves, the brainstem feeling like this is as good as it's going to get. If I'm in concert with the other human beings around me, that's my best shot. If I'm, sort of trying to keep my children alive, that's the best thing I can do. This principle describes human behavior much better than does the selfish gene principle. Under the selfish gene principle, no mom is going to run into a burning building to save her children because she's just thinking, I can have more children, not a problem, right?
Right.
But, that's not how we live. The moms run into the burning building all the time, unless the dads get there first. In other words, we're really, sort of programmed to defend what we care about. And our own somatic well-being, the preservation of my body, is not often actually the thing, when you look hard, that people most care about. They actually most care about preserving the well-being of their community, the well-being of their progeny, the well-being of the people that they care about. And they'll make tremendous personal sacrifices to ensure that kind of well-being. And our culture really lauds people that make those kinds of sacrifices. So it does appear that this kind of pro-social value defense is the organizing principle. Another way to put it is, we used to think that the organizing principle of human physiology was to protect the body. And it's now looking like, at least in many cases, the organizing principle of the body is to protect what you care about. In many cases, what you care about is yourself and your well-being, but there are times when we will trade off our own individual well-being to defend, let's say, our communities against aggressors. People go to war and essentially willingly sacrifice their lives to preserve the well-being of their cultures and nations and communities. People will take tremendous personal risks in order to preserve the well-being of the people that they see, the people that they care about, sometimes just random strangers. People will jump in icy rivers to save them. So there is, as a function of this, we're starting to question whether stress theories that, the core rationale under most stress theories is defend the body at all costs. We're now starting to wonder whether we need to step back and say, we defend the body isn't technically right. Defending what you care about, what the ventral striatum is focused on, that may actually be the fundamental organizing principle of human physiology, is protect what you care about. Lots of times that is going to be your body and your well-being. but sometimes it's going to be other things outside your own individual health and well-being. So if you have an organism like human beings that's organized with that kind of principle, and the ventral striatum can say, okay, you're doing what you should, you don't have to feel personally threatened because the things that you care about, you're advancing, you're taking care, you're doing what has to be done, you're doing the right thing. That sense of well-being seems to trump the sense of well-being that involves simply being happy in the Epicurean sense.
I think that's very interesting. So just so I see if I understood you correctly. So let's say that you're in you're in an adverse, something bad is happening in your life. If you're striving to help your family, or you're striving to perhaps fulfill a goal that is very important to you, then you are able to handle the adversity better than if you would more focus on gratifying your own needs, eating good food, perhaps gratifying more of your kind of biological needs in a sense.
That's right. That's what the data say.
I think that, and I think just what you said before, it really makes sense. I mean, if we would just look at the human species as a whole, what we would like probably for the species as a whole is that people, as we mentioned, that they want to grow, that they want to contribute, that they want to come up with new ideas. And I think one thing that is really, really common, or that is really, really good also in our groups and people that we share, we praise, are people that really contribute. I know that Elon Musk, for example, with his electrical cars, has getting a lot of attention, who seems also to be more eudaimonic in his life than perhaps somebody else.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's a prototypical example of somebody running fundamentally this ventral striatal plan. That guy is excited about discovery. He's excited about making new stuff. He's excited about transforming the world. To the point where he's almost maniacal in this preoccupation with changing the world for the better, sometimes to the great annoyance of the people immediately around him. But nobody doubts that he's powerfully driven by vision. And that's a perfect example of these, what seem to the rest of us lazy people almost as kind of this crazy
what are we doing, Steve?
vision.
What are we doing?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Now, the answer to that is there's all kinds of meaning. I mean, Musk finds his meaning in transforming the world.
Yeah.
So far, there's not a lot of evidence that is, materially better than the kind of meaning that comes from running a restaurant and creating really beautiful food to, make the people around you happy, to help feed humanity. The same kind of mentality might play out in terms of taking care of your family. In terms of building houses, even, sort of the janitor can think about what he or she does in terms of helping to create a clean, healthy community versus I'm just in it to get paid. And that difference in your psychological perspective on what you're doing seems to be the deciding factor in terms of how your physiology is going to respond to it. And how you're going to feel about the work that you do. If you can experience the work you do as meaningful, as significant, as contributing to the community around you, if you can think of the work you do, cleaning the dishes as, creating nutrition and health and cleanliness for a family, that's very much different than I got to do the dishes again. Yeah. The check box has wound around to me or something.
Very interesting. And when you have this more of a eudaimonic well-being, if you're having more of a purpose in your job, for example, what is it that happens with our gene expression compared to if you're not having that purpose in your job, for example?
Well, the easiest way to describe that is to describe first what happens when we're feeling threatened or uncertain. So you can think of our body as having, sort of operating regimes. And we've got one regime that thankfully we inhibit in most of the time. We, sort of live under a plan that says things are basically okay. Just keep doing what you're doing. Or if there's something, that you see that's good, keep, do more of that. But you've got this kind of brainstem threat detection circuitry running all the time, mostly subconsciously, that evaluates the world around you continuously. And every once in a while, it will essentially come to the assessment that the world is not a safe place, or at least that you can't rest assured that everything is going to be okay. I mean, even if you're just uncertain, things are okay. It activates those fight or flight signaling pathways through the sympathetic nervous system. And that signaling eventually makes its way down to, for instance, the immune system. And the cells of the immune system turn on a block of genes involved in inflammation, and they simultaneously inhibit the activity of a block of genes that are involved in defending us against intracellular pathogens like viruses. So essentially, the immune system is programmed to listen to fight or flight stress physiology by activating these inflammatory genes and suppressing the antiviral genes. That makes good sense if the kind of threat that you are encountering is the kind of threat that would wound you. And that's historically been the norm over the hundreds of thousands of years that modern humans have been evolving. It's a reasonably good sort of program to activate, because the thing that plagued us most of that time, the things that we saw, the things that worried us, the things that activated our fight or flight stress responses tended to be predators of one sort or another. They might be, angry members of our village who are coming to stab us. They might be the saber-toothed tiger that's coming to eat us. We might be running from something that's chasing us. So in all of those cases, there's this risk that we're going to get injured. And so that's actually a great time to rev up the genes that are involved in defending you from wounding injury. And inflammatory genes are great at that kind of thing. They're good at battling bacterial infections. They're great at, sort of coordinating tissue reconstruction if you've got tissue damage. And if that cost of defending yourself against viral infections, which tend to travel by close social contact, you can fight the viral infections later. If you have to sort of redeploy resources towards defending yourself against these bacterial infections and the wounds that result, that's probably a pretty good choice to make. The problem with modern life is that the things that plague us now and really worry us generally don't physically harm us. They're more things like, can I keep my business going? Yeah. Can I feed my family? Am I going to get evicted from my household? In none of those cases is there going to be a spear coming into your flesh, but you're born with the wiring from our ancestral conditions that says, okay, get ready to be hurt. And so that inflammatory biology gets turned on, your antiviral defenses get weakened, and then, which, by the way, is also what's happening when people are worried about the coronavirus. That's also what happens when people are feeling chronically lonely, when they have post-traumatic stress disorder, and a wide variety of other circumstances. What we saw in the genome was more inflammation and less antiviral response as a kind of a signature pattern across a wide variety of different adverse life circumstances. So that's what happens when people are feeling threatened and insecure. What's interesting is now we look at these people with high levels of eudaimonic well-being, and even when they're in those threatening or insecure environments, they don't turn on those threat-related gene expression programs anywhere near as strongly as the rest of us do. The people that have a strong sense of purpose they basically don't ramp up their inflammatory biology, because the changing momentary life circumstances, if they don't threaten what these people are pursuing, they really don't worry about it. To take your Elon Musk example, Musk was basically fine building his Teslas even in the early stages of the coronavirus epidemic, in part because he felt like this isn't really that serious. This doesn't imperil what I'm doing to change the world. And then the public health authorities in the area in which his factory existed said, you got to shut your factory down. And then he got really mad. Yeah. And that's because, he felt like, you are standing between me and a better world. You're threatening what I value. So you can kind of piece together, Musk actually doesn't care that much about is he healthy or is he not healthy? You can watch his, sort of behavior as a consumer of giant mansions. He doesn't care that much about the status. He doesn't care that much about the big mansions. He's perfectly happy to sell the big mansions if that's what it takes to advance his, sort of goals of transforming the world, of creating this new way of living, creating these new products. That does make him famous, but he's first and foremost in this not to be famous. He's first and foremost in this stuff to be, sort of to achieve these goals that he feels are within grasp. Things like going to Mars and, sort of living like an all-electric existence in terms of transportation, transforming how we move people around. So this is a perfect example of how you can get eudaimonic people stressed, but the way you stress them is not by threatening their bodies. You stress them by threatening their goals.
Yeah, and I actually have heard a conversation with or an interview with him saying that his life was at some points was like eating glass, kind of like that he was really going through a lot of tough stuff. But I mean, if he wouldn't have had the purpose and the eudaimonic well-being, then perhaps he would really have been burnt out and really wouldn't have been able to. Wouldn't be able to function at all, perhaps.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And that's actually a very common theme, that adversity, in the significant sense, not, most of us feel like, oh, I'm so stressed and worried and anxious. But when you look at our lives by the standards, even of a few generations ago, much less a century ago, we are really ridiculously privileged. Even the poorest of us lives better than kings did 50 or 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So humanity in general has done a great job of improving its lot. But the thing about human beings is they judge their well-being relative to other human beings. So even if we're all living better than the kings did 100 years ago, that still doesn't stop people from feeling like it's not just, it's not fair that somebody else has $1 billion and I don't. And they're not wrong about that, because you know what? Those billionaires do occasionally decide that they're going to do whatever they want, and they will use lawyers or governments or whatever they can apply pressure to get what they want. And if you're in their way, they are going to run over you. So human life is still filled with these deep inequities in terms of power. And in fact, as we all know, those inequities are actually getting larger over time. The range of variation of individual power, which you can kind of metric in economic terms, has grown dramatically larger just within our lifetimes. So even over the last 20 years, we've gone from, like billionaires being an oddity to billionaires being, essentially a social class. And the amount of, sort of variation in how different members of society live is dramatically larger now than it was 50 years ago. And that's in no small part the root of the political upheaval that we've seen recently, this sense that some people are more powerful and more privileged than others, and a growing range of people feeling like they are not being accorded the same amount of power and self-determination that other members of society are, and they're feeling like that is fundamentally unfair, that they should have a more, sort of equitable power base. What you can read between the lines there is that anytime people feel low in power, they feel threatened. They feel like everything might be okay. I might have my speedboat and my big screen TV, but if somebody wants to, they can take all of that from me. And frankly, they're not wrong about that. I mean, they may be wrong about that in where you live, but they're not wrong about that here in America.
Okay.
If you've got the money, you can do what you want. That's kind of the price of freedom in some sense. So that's what you're seeing is between the lines, people feeling like I am not safe. I mean, even if I don't see anything objectively wrong at the moment, I know I cannot be certain that this will all be okay. I cannot be certain that I will be treated fairly or with dignity. I cannot be certain that I will be able to defend myself or my family. I cannot be certain that I will have a job. I cannot be certain that people will accord me the dignity that, let's say, sort of a sort of a like somebody who graduated from a prestigious college and now is working in the technology industry. There's all these, as for better or worse, these grades and variations of status that are becoming more and more precipitous. And the people that live on the low end of that status totem pole, they know they live there. They know they're vulnerable, and their bodies are responding in exactly the way you would expect. Their bodies essentially are running around saying, I cannot expect to be safe. I need to prepare to be injured. As absurd as this sounds, that's essentially what their brainstem is doing, is saying, all the powerful people above you at any time could step on you. You need to be ready to be hurt. And that kind of bracing yourself for abuse from others leads to, hypervigilant psychology, leading people to be, sort of irritable and impulsive. It leads to a kind of live fast, die young mentality in terms of risk taking. And it leads to this kind of chronic molecular defense program that ends up mortgaging your future to maximize your defense against present wounding injury. So that is actually probably the defining challenge of our time, is how are we going to help people feel secure in a world that by every objective standard is much more healthy and secure than any generation ever has been, but is also much more precipitously stratified. There's more gradations of social power. And that, I think the answer is going to have to be getting back to living for community, because living for yourself, is not going to be a recipe for people feeling like they can be secure or dominate others. They're going to have to feel like humans traditionally have derived their sense of security from the communities they live in, not from their own individual strength. So in some sense, that's the big challenge, is getting humans back to the kind of communal mentality that we've always had, but in societies that are fundamentally fair and allow people to feel secure because of their alliance with others, not feel threatened because of the presence of others.
Right. I think a lot of people really learned a lot today. I mean, both about, human nature, and we also learned about the Eudaimonic Well-Being and how that seemed to affect us, and a lot of other stuff. Steve, before we hang up, like if somebody would like to find your work, or perhaps if you have a web page or social media, whatever, where can people find you?
I don't have a web page, oddly enough.
Good for you.
I stay on social media because I found it to be kind of a toxic environment.
Yeah.
So the easiest way to find me, thankfully, these days is you can just Google my name and a bunch of this stuff will come up. And it's important to note that I am not a good storyteller around my own story, but thankfully other people have started to, professional storytellers have started to write about this kind of thing. So, there's great articles as well as YouTube, copies of my talks out there, both around the basics of social genomics. So you can just Google Steve Cole, social genomics. You can Google Steve Cole, Eudaimonic Well-Being. You can Google Steve Cole on, sort of poverty and coronavirus and that kind of stuff. There's a number of different treatments of this, and there's more, essentially every day. So I would say at this point, that's actually the best way to do it. Not that Google is perfect, but they update faster than I can update.
I think that's a very good tip, and also using YouTube to search for you there. That's how I found a couple of different presentations. For somebody who would like to learn more about genomics and all the things that we have been talking about today, do you have any tips on a book that could be used for a layperson, or web pages, or YouTube accounts, or whatever?
There's
hard question
that are available. Yeah, exactly. And that, it depends on how serious you are about this. I would recommend doing exactly what you just suggested, which is watch the videos first.
Yeah.
And then, once you watch the talks and the videos and the various kind of flavors of all this thing, then start adding more search terms. And once you do that, you'll start to get to interpretive articles from places like The Atlantic, or from, sort of Rolling Stone just did one. Just all these different takes on what we do from these different perspectives and different angles. So the more you kind of can pick up keywords from the talks, the more you can navigate towards these really well-told stories. There's also some books where people have written about this. There's a recent book on Friends that tells this story pretty well, by Lydia Denworth, I believe.
Exactly, yeah.
And some, yeah.
I've actually done an episode with her.
Oh,
yeah.
great.
Yeah. I think it's called Friendships. I can't remember exactly now on the top of my head. But yeah, if you search for Lydia Denworth and then friendship, then you'll find her book for sure.
Yeah, something like Friendship, A Natural History or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well,
yeah, so that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, for sure. Steve, it's been really, really nice talking to you. And I think that, as I mentioned before, I think that people listening really have learned a lot. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about your research in the future and learning more about what your thought will be about, eudaimonic well-being and all that kind of stuff and how that affects genes. So I'll personally be looking out for the stuff that you've done. But big thank you for coming on and sharing all your knowledge and everything.
My pleasure. Keep up the good work. Fascinating project you guys have going here, and I'm happy to chat with you in the future once we make some progress at least.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you again, Stephen. Take care.
Sure, my pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Friends, I really need your help. I'm trying to get the podcast out there. So I was wondering if you could help me by leaving a positive rating and a review on your Apple device or the podcast player that you're using, as well as subscribing to the podcast. That really helps getting the show more visible on iTunes and other players. And if you don't know how it's done, then YouTube has a lot of great videos, so you can search there. All right, that's it. Take care. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, including the giving of medical advice. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.